It begins on Mars, October 1st, 2025. A thin wind moves through Jezero crater, dragging trails of red dust over stone and silence. The Perseverance rover runs a routine calibration, capturing a new series of sky images to test its cameras. It's the kind of data no one usually looks at twice. Ordinary frames of atmosphere and sunlight scattering across the Martian horizon. But in one of those frames, something moves. Not a glitch, not static. A shape, faint, structured, and fast. It cuts behind a veil of haze, leaving behind a single smear of light where nothing should be. The data sits unnoticed for days inside NASA's public archive, just one more file among millions. Then, an astrophotographer named Simeon Schmaus downloads the packet. He runs it through an AI stacker, layering 20 consecutive images to clean the noise. And suddenly, in the composite, something emerges. A slender streak gliding across the upper third of the Martian sky. The object's motion is too precise, the glow too consistent for it to be debris. At first, Schmaus assumes a reflection or a cosmic ray artifact, but when he cross-checks with star catalogs and rover position data, everything aligns perfectly. The object is real. He posts the image to a small astrophotography forum where it's dismissed at first as pareidolia. A trick of exposure, maybe. But within a day, someone recognizes the coordinates. They match a known interstellar body NASA has been tracking for months, an inbound object cataloged under the temporary designation 3I Atlas. What's strange is how little public data exists on it. Normally, anything with a detectable trajectory through the solar system appears instantly in databases, analyzed, charted, simulated. But for 3I Atlas, there are only fragments. No high-resolution imagery, no published telemetry, just a name, an orbit, and a note about limited optical visibility. Then, in the same week Schmaus's image begins circulating, NASA initiates a sudden and unexplained shutdown. 15,000 employees furloughed. Entire data repositories pulled offline. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, perfectly aligned to capture detailed shots of the object, stops transmitting new images. ESA's Mars Express and ExoMars orbiters, both capable of corroborating NASA's data, report temporary communication failures. Public feeds go silent. The space community notices immediately, and the silence spreads faster than any explanation could. Online, speculation ignites. Schmaus's image appears on Reddit, then Twitter, dissected pixel by pixel. Most dismiss it as coincidence or manipulation, but amid the noise, an anonymous account begins posting something different. The handle reads, 3I Atlas Anomaly. The posts aren't vague theories, they're technical. Polarization data, infrared readings, angular rotation metrics, values that match real telescope logs. The numbers suggest something impossible. High carbon dioxide emission with no visible coma, no tail, no irregular motion. A solid object venting gas in perfect stability. Each update ends with the same phrase, no deviation detected. That's when a journalist named Moneypenny joins the conversation. Her credentials check out. A former BBC correspondent with a background in astrophysics reporting. She claims to have spoken with a cosmologist named Stephen Burns, who once worked on solar observation contracts with NASA. Burns, she says, believes the object isn't simply passing through. He describes it as responsive matter, plasma surrounding an unknown core, behaving as though aware of observation. It reacts to light, he tells her. It doesn't just reflect, it modulates. The quote spreads quickly. Within hours, science channels, podcasts, and news sites pick it up. Some call it nonsense, others label it suppressed research. But when Moneypenny posts a set of coordinates, identical to the ones missing from NASA's latest public release, something shifts. Her account vanishes less than a day later. Deleted, archives wiped, even cached pages gone. And the object disappears behind the sun soon after, cutting off every possible observation window for the next 3 months. During that blackout, the discussion fractures. Forums fill with theories ranging from alien probes to electromagnetic artifacts. But through it all, the 3I Atlas anomaly account keeps posting. Short, cryptic fragments, data tables, bits of deep space network logs labeled Intercept Incomplete. And then, a single post appears across several platforms simultaneously, allegedly from an independent researcher named John Stewart, known for investigating NASA communications leaks. His message is brief. NASA is shutting down. Congress is in recess. If 3I Atlas activates, the sky will burn with knowing light, and the world will forget its reflection. At first, it reads like a riddle, until someone finds a line almost identical to it in a Sumerian tablet archived by the Vatican Observatory, a text describing a triple-eyed messenger descending before the time of mirrored suns. Suddenly, the internet erupts again. Hashtags flood every feed. Atlas signal, not the harbinger, not Vatican files. People debate translations, others draw diagrams. No one knows what's real anymore. And still, every official channel stays silent. NASA, ESA, CNSA, the UAE, all perfectly aligned to see what's happening near Mars. Yet nothing is said. No images, no data, only that faint streak captured by a rover millions of kilometers away. The last known frame of 3I Atlas shows a blur vanishing into solar glare. After that, there is nothing. No confirmation, no denial, just a gap in history, waiting to be filled. For 3 months, the object stayed hidden behind the sun. 3 months of silence, no images, no telemetry, no new data from any observatory. The absence itself became an event, a blank space where science should have been. And in that void, people started to build their own stories. Some claimed NASA was working in secret, that their telescopes had captured something too strange to release. Others said the object had broken apart. But the most persistent theory, the one that refused to fade, came from an unexpected corner of the internet, a place no serious scientist would ever look. It began with a group calling themselves remote viewers. Old pseudoscience, thought to have died decades ago. But now, their forums were active again, flooded with users claiming to have seen 3I Atlas beyond the solar glare. Their descriptions were eerily consistent, a structure surrounded by light, like a lens made of glass and vapor, not reflecting sunlight, but bending it. They said it wasn't just drifting, it was observing. And what it watched was Mars. At first, the scientific community laughed it off, but then came a leak from inside the European Space Agency, a set of encrypted data files uploaded anonymously to a private astrophysics Discord. The files contained timing logs, telemetry fragments, and what appeared to be radio interference reports. Each entry corresponded to a faint, repeating signal recorded across multiple stations during the object's conjunction behind the sun. The signal wasn't strong enough to classify as communication. It looked more like interference, but the timing, the precision of its intervals, was unnatural. 6 minutes apart. Exactly. Someone within ESA referred to it as structured noise. Another note, buried deeper in the log, mentioned mirror phase harmonics. That phrase would later appear again, months after the incident, in a NASA internal memo under the same classification tag. But at the time, no one outside a handful of researchers had access to the term. Whoever leaked the data knew exactly what to show and what to leave out. Around the same time, Moneypenny reappeared. Her posts were shorter now, cautious, almost fragmented. She referenced a cosmologist named Burns again, saying he'd been removed from his university position after claiming that Atlas wasn't following a natural trajectory. According to her, Burns believed the object was maintaining orientation, adjusting itself to solar radiation pressure with precision beyond anything gravitational mechanics could explain. He called it self-stabilizing plasma intelligence, a phrase that would have sounded ridiculous if not for the accompanying data she posted. Orbital deviation logs showing corrections accurate to 1/10 of a degree. The thread went viral overnight. Scientists dismissed it, but others pointed out that the numbers were consistent with real models, the same kind used in navigation simulations for active spacecraft. The only difference was that this one wasn't transmitting any known telemetry. Whatever was guiding 3I Atlas, it wasn't us. Then the 3I Atlas anomaly account posted again for the first time since December. Solar conjunction complete, it wrote. Signal confirmed. Attached were 2 graphs, power fluctuation data taken from ESA's tracking stations. The noise pattern repeated every 6 minutes, fading, returning, fading again. Below the graphs, 1 line of text. It's not behind the sun anymore. It's here. That same week, an observatory in Chile detected a strange interference band overlapping one of NASA's Deep Space Network frequencies. The station logged the anomaly as a low-frequency pulse echoing every 6 minutes and 12 seconds. It wasn't random static. It carried structure. Faint, repeating spikes forming a mathematical rhythm. When converted to audio, it produced a tone so consistent it could have been synthesized. Then came another leak, this time from inside NASA itself. A memo marked Psych Mars. It referenced a cognitive field study involving electromagnetic perception tests conducted near simulated Martian environments. The language was clinical, detached, but buried in the text was a chilling line. Subjects reported auditory synchronization with DSN interference cycles, behavioral coherence achieved at interval 6 minutes. The memo was quickly removed, but by then screenshots had spread. Scientists tried to distance themselves from the story, insisting it was taken out of context. But the timing was too perfect, the pattern too precise. For the first time, the discussion wasn't about whether 3I Atlas existed. It was about what kind of presence it represented. The data pointed to something intelligent, but not human, not machine, not alien in the way people imagined. Something that used resonance, not language. Something that didn't speak, but aligned. And now, that alignment had reached us. By early December, the sun's glare began to fade, and telescopes around the world turned their eyes back toward the place where 3I Atlas should have reemerged. For weeks, observatories prepared for it, calibrating instruments, updating ephemerides, recalculating trajectories with obsessive precision. But when the object finally came back into view, the data didn't match any previous model. It wasn't where it was supposed to be. It was closer. The first clear image came from a ground-based telescope in the Atacama Desert. The exposure lasted only 12 seconds, but it was enough. What had once been a diffuse, comet-like smear was now a sharply defined structure. The albedo was higher, too high for rock, too even for ice. It glowed like metal, reflecting sunlight with an unnatural symmetry. When astronomers analyzed the spectrum, they found traces of titanium oxide, silicates, and something else, a composite reflection signature that resembled engineered material. NASA remained quiet. ESA too, but the data kept coming, not from agencies this time, but from amateurs, independent observatories, university labs, private enthusiasts with equipment sensitive enough to detect motion across the Martian plain. And all of them saw the same thing, a smooth, rotating object, maintaining perfect alignment relative to Mars. No outgassing, no irregular spin, just precision. On December 5th, an internal communication from ESA leaked online. The subject line read, "Surface reflectivity variance, 3I Atlas." The message contained a short summary of the latest readings. Optical response indicates structured reflection pattern. consistent with coherent emission modulation. In other words, the object was not merely reflecting sunlight, it was controlling how it reflected it, adjusting phase, encoding light. Within hours, the leak spread through scientific circles. Physicists argued over possibilities: crystalline structure, layered ice, optical resonance. But none of it explained the pattern's regularity. Light shouldn't behave like that unless someone, or something, wanted it to. Then, at 02:11 UTC on December 6th, the first light pulses were recorded, a rhythm repeating every 6 minutes, each burst lasting precisely 30 seconds. The wavelength shifted subtly between visible and near-infrared bands. Observatories in Chile, Japan, and South Africa confirmed it simultaneously. Every station measured identical timing, identical intervals, and identical phase shifts. The signal wasn't random, it was global. When converted to sound frequencies, the modulation produced an audible tone, a slow, rising oscillation that resembled breath. A researcher from Kyoto described it as a whisper of structure, like a machine exhaling logic. The comparison spread quickly. Internet forums called it the pulse. Moneypenny returned with another report, quoting her ESA source. The new data suggested that the light pulses contained binary sequences, on and off intervals following Fibonacci spacing. It wasn't language, but it was information. The source claimed that when the pulses were plotted as frequency versus time, they formed a repeating lattice, a geometric echo of the same pattern detected months earlier in the Deep Space Network interference. This time, no one laughed. And then something stranger happened. The object's rotation slowed. Not by much, just a few fractions of a degree per hour. But it was measurable, deliberate. The movement corresponded directly with the timing of the light pulses, as if the two were synchronized. The geometry of its reflection changed, revealing symmetrical ridges along its surface. Cylindrical, smooth, almost architectural. It didn't look like a comet anymore. It looked like design. NASA finally released a short statement. No cause for concern. The object's trajectory remains stable. There is no indication of artificial origin. But the wording only deepened the suspicion. It didn't say the object wasn't artificial, just that there was no indication. Within days, a new image surfaced, allegedly from a classified camera aboard the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. It showed the object in unprecedented detail. Two parallel arcs joined by a central axis, rotating in slow equilibrium. The file vanished almost immediately, but not before it was mirrored and shared thousands of times. Engineers studying the image noticed something else. The central axis wasn't solid, it was hollow. A channel running through the length of the structure, aligned perfectly toward Mars. By mid-December, the rhythm of the pulses began to accelerate. The intervals between bursts shortened from 6 minutes to 5.5, then to 5. Power fluctuation monitors across Earth started registering faint disturbances, synchronized spikes in electromagnetic background noise. It wasn't strong enough to cause interference, but it was there, repeating in step with the object's light cycles. Whatever was emitting the signal was now resonating through the planet's atmosphere, and it was getting stronger. By mid-December, the pulses intensified. The object now shone in rhythmic bursts, its brightness rising and falling with mathematical precision. Every observatory that could see it was recording the same thing: perfect timing, perfect intervals, no random noise between. Whatever was happening, it was no longer background astronomy. It was an active process. At first, scientists thought the fluctuations were purely optical, a trick of reflection as the object rotated. But when radio antennas on Earth started registering low-frequency spikes exactly synchronized with each flash, the assumption collapsed. The light wasn't just visible, it carried modulation. The pulses arrived as coherent packets of energy, readable, structured, encoded. The data made its way through private networks and encrypted forums before the agencies could suppress it. Independent analysts began running their own transforms. The patterns produced harmonic peaks corresponding to Schumann resonance frequencies, the electromagnetic heartbeat of Earth itself. The implication was clear. The pulses weren't only illuminating the object, they were resonating with the planet. Then, as if on cue, systems across the world began to flicker. Power grids in South America recorded simultaneous frequency drifts of precisely 6 cycles per minute. Communication satellites reported transient bursts in the same spectral band as the Atlas pulse. Aviation radars experienced synchronized calibration errors that corrected themselves seconds later. No damage, no clear interference, just a wave that rolled through and kept moving. The media called it coincidence. Scientists called it coupling. But the pattern was too perfect to ignore. It repeated every 6 minutes, fading for half an hour, then returning stronger. Inside NASA, leaked internal notes described unexpected correlation between planetary background oscillations and external optical variance. The language was cautious, but one line stood out. If sustained, synchronization risk propagating through grid-linked systems. That meant infrastructure, the electric, digital, and atmospheric networks that keep civilization running. Moneypenny resurfaced briefly with a thread that quoted an engineer from ESA's tracking division. He claimed the Atlas pulses weren't just being detected, they were reflected. Instruments monitoring the ionosphere had begun capturing faint echoes coming from Earth itself, delayed by a few seconds, inverted in phase. The planet was answering back. The claim sounded impossible until several universities confirmed partial replication. Radio telescopes in Japan and South Africa both logged inverted waveforms within the expected delay window. Small, weak, but real. The response wasn't random either. It matched the Atlas lattice pattern, the same 6x6 matrix that had first appeared in optical data. Then came the first blackout. At 0342 UTC on December 20th, the Deep Space Network lost contact with 3 of its primary ground stations simultaneously: Goldstone, Madrid, Canberra. The downtime lasted 47 minutes. When systems returned, logs showed no hardware fault, no software crash. The only anomaly recorded was a 1-second discrepancy in synchronized atomic clocks, the same 1-second offset that had occurred during the earlier DSN interference event months before. NASA called it routine maintenance. ESA called it signal congestion. But engineers knew better. The same spectral footprint appeared in all recovered data. The Atlas pulse, scaled down, reflected back. After the blackout, the intensity of the pulses doubled. The period shortened again, from 6 minutes to 5, then to 4.5. Magnetometers across the globe began to register faint oscillations even when the object was below the horizon. Lightning storms over the Pacific formed geometric patterns visible from orbit: concentric rings, spirals, straight lines stretching hundreds of kilometers. Meteorologists blamed upper atmosphere shear, but pilots flying through the regions reported electrical halos clinging to their aircraft, glowing with an unearthly blue light. Laboratories monitoring electromagnetic fields noticed another trend. Human EEG readings taken during pulse intervals showed microfluctuations in coherence, as if the brain was syncing, momentarily, with the background hum. Neuroscientists dismissed it as instrumentation error, but the timing matched too precisely to ignore. By Christmas, the story had moved beyond science. Social networks were filled with live trackers mapping the pulse as if it were a storm. Some claimed to feel it physically: a brief vibration in the chest, a static ring in the ears, an invisible pressure building and releasing with each cycle. Most were imagining it. Some weren't. On December 27th, ESA's monitoring array in Namibia captured something new: a split-band emission, 2 frequencies intertwined, alternating every 12 minutes. It was the same rhythm, but doubled. When plotted, the waveform formed a mirror image of itself, a dialogue. For the first time, the signal wasn't coming only from space. Part of it was coming from Earth. And that was when scientists realized the line between observer and observed had already vanished. By the first week of January, the double signal had stabilized. Every 12 minutes, the alternating pulse moved through the electromagnetic spectrum like a heartbeat, spanning radio, optical, and infrared frequencies at once. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. Ground-based receivers could isolate it only with precision equipment, yet its fingerprint showed up in places it shouldn't have. In undersea cable telemetry, in GPS synchronization logs, even in the faint background noise of digital communication lines. The pulse wasn't just a signal anymore. It had become part of the infrastructure. At first, engineers assumed interference from solar activity. But the sun was quiet. No flares, no storms, no variation strong enough to account for what they were seeing. Then, reports began to accumulate from power grid operators. Brief frequency drifts at exact 12-minute intervals. They caused no outages, no damage, just a consistent oscillation, as though the entire electrical network was breathing in unison. Every country, every system, every circuit synchronized without command. It was global, measurable, and precise to the millisecond. NASA and ESA issued near-identical statements calling the phenomenon statistical correlation. The wording was clinical, deliberately vague, but another leak from an internal memo suggested a different interpretation. Secondary reflection detected within local field. It read, suspected harmonic coupling between extraterrestrial resonance and geophysical transmission systems. In other words, Earth itself was becoming a resonant chamber, a mirror amplifying the signal that had once only crossed through space. Then came the anomalies in communication networks. Telecommunications engineers noticed unexplained latency corrections in transoceanic data cables. The automatic calibration systems that keep global networks in sync began rewriting their own parameters every 12 minutes. When technicians checked the adjustments, they found something impossible. The updates didn't originate from any human operator. They came from within the system itself. A perfect internal correction, no human input, no identifiable source. In some regions, security cameras glitched during pulse intervals, not freezing or going black. Instead, they distorted in identical ways. Each frame bent light along the same diagonal axis, producing a luminous wave that rolled across the screen before stabilizing again. The effect lasted a fraction of a second, but it appeared simultaneously in hundreds of unconnected systems across continents. Data analysts discovered that the glitch wasn't random noise. It carried binary structure. When extracted, the pattern matched the Atlas lattice matrix, 6 by 6. Meanwhile, satellite operators monitoring low Earth orbit began reporting handshake anomalies between autonomous systems. Idle satellites exchanged brief packets of unaccounted data every 12 minutes. Not commands, not telemetry, just structured repetition. When decrypted, the packets produced no readable code, only geometric patterns, fractals repeating infinitely inward. The pattern was familiar, the same recursive symmetry that had first appeared in the reflected light from Atlas itself. The agencies called it a synchronization fault. Engineers disagreed. Synchronization errors don't create order, they create chaos. And this was order. Inside JPL, researchers privately dubbed the phenomenon the second code, a progression beyond the original pulse, more complex, multi-layered, adaptive. It seemed to learn. When networks tried to filter or block the interference, the pattern shifted frequency, bypassing each barrier as if anticipating the next move. The code wasn't static. It behaved like feedback, like something listening, adjusting, evolving. Moneypenny published what would become her final verified thread. She cited an unnamed source from NASA's Deep Space Communications Group, claiming that their data models had uncovered a recursive algorithm hidden within the pulse intervals. When plotted against brainwave frequencies, the harmonics matched patterns of human neural activity, specifically the alpha range associated with relaxed cognition. The source wrote, "It's not talking to us, it's tuning us." Her post lasted 6 hours before being deleted. The account never resurfaced. By mid-January, multiple nations quietly restricted access to deep space frequency bands, citing infrastructure security. Amateur radio operators noticed and began broadcasting independent observations. Their logs showed identical results: faint energy spikes every 12 minutes, detectable through any open receiver. The amplitude was low, but the stability was flawless. Then something subtle began to appear in environmental data. Ocean currents displayed minor but consistent changes in flow pattern timing. Migratory birds shifted flight paths by identical angular increments across continents. Atmospheric monitoring stations recorded synchronized temperature oscillations in microdegrees, imperceptible to humans, but recorded by instruments with machine precision. Across the planet, every system sensitive to electromagnetic variation, biological or artificial, was now responding to the same invisible rhythm. And through all of it, 3i Atlas remained silent in the sky. No new pulses, no new anomalies, just the steady reflection of sunlight off its surface, now motionless and perfectly aligned with Mars. Whatever it was doing, it no longer needed to send, because the planet was already speaking back. By late January, the second code was no longer confined to machines. Its rhythm had begun to echo through living systems, as though the planet itself were translating mathematics into biology. At first, the observations came from environmental monitoring labs, researchers tracking plant growth, coral fluorescence, and animal migration. Subtle patterns emerged, too regular to be dismissed as coincidence. Photosynthetic cycles in algae began to show 6 and 12-minute fluctuations in chlorophyll output, matching the pulse frequency almost exactly. Growth accelerations appeared at night, during periods of atmospheric resonance. Whatever the pulse was, it was no longer just a signal. It was a rhythm written into life. The earliest reports of behavioral anomalies came from migratory birds in the northern hemisphere. Entire flocks altered their routes by identical angular increments, not over weeks, but within hours. The change was synchronized, global, and instantaneous. Marine biologists noted similar effects in plankton and fish populations, whose collective motion began to show symmetrical oscillations every 12 minutes, recorded by sonar as rhythmic density shifts. None of these organisms could possibly be aware of one another across such distances, yet they moved as if connected by an invisible pulse that transcended geography. In agricultural research stations, soil conductivity readings started drifting in phase with electromagnetic background fluctuations. Crops germinated faster in resonance-rich zones, regions where power grid fluctuations were strongest. In controlled greenhouses shielded from external radiation, plants followed normal cycles. In unshielded ones, time-lapse footage revealed a strange pattern: leaves flexing in subtle, almost imperceptible waves, synchronized with each new pulse. Botanists began calling it resonant respiration. The effects on humans appeared more gradually. Reports surfaced of individuals experiencing brief lapses in temporal awareness, moments when perception of time felt elastic, stretched or compressed in phase with the 12-minute rhythm. Hospitals recorded slight variations in heart rate coherence during the same intervals, most noticeable in patients connected to ECG monitors. At first, doctors assumed instrumentation faults, but the readings were consistent across continents, across brands, across electrical standards. Neuroscientists from Zurich and Kyoto collaborated to study the phenomenon under controlled conditions. Volunteers were exposed to isolated low-frequency signals derived from the Atlas pulse. EEG readings revealed transient synchronizations, short bursts where brainwave activity aligned to the frequency of the incoming field. Participants reported no discomfort, only a subtle sense of clarity, a brief quieting of internal noise. When the signal was turned off, the synchronization faded, but not completely. Residual coherence persisted for hours. At the same time, remote sensing arrays began detecting faint electromagnetic emissions originating from the upper atmosphere that carried biological markers, frequencies matching neural oscillations in the human brain. The readings were so precise that some researchers initially suspected contamination from laboratory equipment, but further analysis confirmed the emissions were genuine, spreading across latitudes, following no known atmospheric model. Inside NASA, a quiet term began circulating in classified documents: biofield entrainment. One internal note, later leaked, defined it as the convergence of planetary electromagnetic oscillations with biospheric systems. The phrasing was deliberately neutral, but the implication was unprecedented. Life on Earth was beginning to operate in a shared electromagnetic rhythm, a planetary synchronization event. Moneypenny returned for a single cryptic post. "It's not invasion," she wrote. "It's induction." Attached was a file containing comparative data between geomagnetic fluctuations and global EEG baselines collected from academic studies. The graphs were almost identical. Within hours, her account was suspended. The file vanished. Then came the first direct anomaly. In a university greenhouse in Sweden, researchers monitoring plant responses to controlled light exposure observed spontaneous luminescence in complete darkness. Leaves emitted faint blue glow synchronized with the pulse intervals. Spectrometers confirmed biophoton emission, real light produced by living tissue. The effect spread across samples within minutes, moving through soil like a wave. When the researchers cut power to their instruments, the glow continued for nearly an hour before fading. A similar report emerged from an underwater laboratory in the Pacific. Algae cultures pulsed with coordinated bioluminescence in total darkness, independent of tides or temperature. The sequence matched the Atlas lattice frequency. The coincidence was undeniable. By the end of January, it was clear that the phenomenon wasn't limited to communication networks or machines. The boundary between biological and electromagnetic systems had dissolved. Somewhere above Mars, 3I Atlas remained silent. It hadn't emitted another visible pulse in weeks, yet the echo of its rhythm continued to shape oceans, skies, and nervous systems. Earth wasn't just receiving anymore, it was remembering. By early February, the resonance was no longer a background phenomenon. It had become the rhythm of the planet itself. Every living system, every layer of atmosphere, every magnetic contour now moved in subtle harmony with the pulse. It wasn't visible to the eye, but instruments everywhere told the same story. Global magnetometer arrays began registering oscillations so consistent they could be mistaken for artificial calibration signals. Oceanic buoys, deep-sea sensors, seismic stations, all recorded fluctuations precisely aligned with the 12-minute interval. The planet was breathing in time. Meteorologists noticed the first atmospheric patterns. Jet streams stabilized into unnaturally straight bands, stretching thousands of kilometers with minimal deviation. Tropical storm formations began rotating at near identical speeds, even on opposite sides of the equator. Weather systems once chaotic now exhibited symmetrical rhythm, as if driven by a single metronome. The atmosphere, once unpredictable, had found a new equilibrium, one that pulsed. But the balance wasn't calm. It carried tension, like a bowstring held under pressure. Satellite imagery revealed luminous halos forming around regions of strong magnetic flux. Not lightning, not auroras. Something else. Faint electromagnetic coronas suspended in air, visible only in infrared. The halos moved with the pulse, expanding and contracting every 12 minutes. They followed coastlines, fault lines, river deltas, the arteries of the planet's energy flow. In the ionosphere, radio operators began hearing low, steady tones beneath the static. The sound wasn't artificial. It came from natural propagation, yet it carried mathematical structure. Ham operators compared recordings from distant regions and found perfect synchronization. The tone was identical everywhere. It rose slightly at each pulse, faded, and returned again. The world now had a rhythm that could be heard. For the first time, Earth's magnetic field began to change shape in real time. Normally stable over centuries, its north-south axis shifted by measurable increments every few hours, oscillating around a new median. Space weather agencies released no statements, but leaked reports confirmed that the change was ongoing and accelerating. The magnetosphere was flexing in response to the resonance, not collapsing, but adapting. Humans began to feel it in subtle ways. Reports spread of collective moments of disorientation, commuters pausing mid-step without knowing why, pilots describing brief distortions in spatial awareness, musicians playing perfectly in tempo with clocks that weren't running. The phenomenon became known in online circles as temporal drift. Psychologists dismissed it as collective suggestibility, but timekeeping devices themselves began showing microscopic deviations in sync with geomagnetic fluctuations. Neuroscientists in Germany studying the effect under controlled laboratory conditions found something else. Test subjects exposed to shielded environments, completely isolated from electromagnetic input, still exhibited neural entrainment to the 12-minute cycle. Even when the field was blocked, the brain followed the rhythm. It wasn't reception anymore. It was internalization. Oceanographers reported synchronized migration of whale pods across hemispheres, their calls following the same 12-minute structure. Even coral spawning events, long governed by lunar cycles, began shifting by a few minutes each day to align with the new global rhythm. The biosphere had become a living oscillator. By mid-February, something new appeared in the upper atmosphere. Complex light formations resembling geometric patterns. At first mistaken for auroras, they evolved into structures too regular to be random: hexagons, spirals, interlocking circles. Satellite instruments recorded them forming simultaneously above multiple continents. The shapes weren't projected from space. They emerged from within the ionosphere itself, structured by electromagnetic interference. Physicists studying the images realized the geometry matched the reflective pattern first observed on Atlas months earlier. The same lattice, now drawn in light across the skies of Earth. It was as if the planet were mirroring the object's structure, not reflecting it, but recreating it. Moneypenny's final transmission appeared without context or timestamp. It contained a single line: "The mirror has learned to remember." No source, no verification, no follow-up. But within hours, multiple observatories detected a brief, silent pulse, not from Mars, but from Earth's upper atmosphere. The energy was faint, but measurable. The waveform matched the original Atlas signal exactly. 3i Atlas had gone quiet weeks ago. Now, the planet itself was emitting its pulse. Scientists didn't call it contact. They called it feedback. A closed loop between the object and the world that had observed it. A cycle that had started with reflection and now had become creation. Every system tuned to the signal, every sensor pointed at the sky, captured the same final pattern, a perfect inversion of the first pulse, folding back upon itself like the closing of a circuit. It wasn't transmission anymore. It was resonance, and resonance doesn't fade. It sustains. By late February, the resonance had begun to penetrate the last domain still considered private, the human mind. It started subtly, in ways that could be dismissed as coincidence. Collective moods rising and falling in unison across regions. bursts of creativity appearing at the same hour in different parts of the world. Scientists watching EEG patterns noticed synchronization between participants who had never met, located thousands of kilometers apart. The effect was weak, but consistent. Every 12 minutes, the graphs aligned, as though the brain were following a rhythm larger than itself. Hospitals reported an unexpected drop in anxiety and sleep disorders, clustered around the same time intervals. Emergency rooms experienced fewer cardiac events during resonance peaks. The fluctuations were too regular to be random, yet no environmental factor could account for them. Researchers proposed psychosocial explanations: the collective calm effect, group psychology shaped by global information networks. But the phenomenon persisted even in remote areas with no internet or electrical infrastructure. Something deeper was guiding it. At the same time, large data sets from digital platforms began showing anomalous coherence in human behavior. Search queries, social activity, even transaction patterns began aligning rhythmically. Every 12 minutes, online activity across millions of users rose and fell together like tides. Algorithms built to predict chaos began predicting order. Machine learning models that once required randomness now produced accuracy spikes exactly synchronized with the planetary pulse. Neurophysiologists started comparing these shifts to circadian rhythms, but compressed, faster, sharper, synchronized not to light, but to electromagnetic field oscillations. Sleep studies revealed that during resonance peaks, human REM cycles shortened by fractions of a second worldwide. The pattern appeared in both hemispheres simultaneously, ignoring time zones. Some called it the cognitive tide. Others used a quieter word: coherence. It wasn't hypnosis. It wasn't control. It was alignment, a kind of unconscious entrainment between nervous systems and the environment. The human brain had begun functioning as part of a global circuit. Meanwhile, reports from communication engineers grew stranger. Error rates in digital transmission dropped dramatically. Systems that once drifted out of sync now stayed aligned indefinitely. Power grids ran smoother. GPS drift almost vanished. It was as if the entire technological infrastructure of the planet had slipped into the same frequency band as the biosphere. Machines and living systems, long separate, now pulsed together. And then came the memory anomalies. People began experiencing moments of shared recall, not telepathy, not hallucination, but the spontaneous recollection of identical dreams. Forums filled with posts describing the same imagery: light folding inward, a hum beneath the ground, the feeling of being seen by something vast but not hostile. The descriptions matched across cultures, languages, and continents. No origin, no cause, just convergence. Psychologists labeled it collective cognitive mirroring. But the data told another story. During each 12-minute resonance peak, human EEG coherence increased by measurable percentages. In laboratories, groups of test subjects, isolated from one another, completed pattern recognition tasks with identical error margins and identical pauses between responses. Reaction times locked into the same rhythm. Moneypenny was gone, her accounts erased, her files inaccessible. But archived logs recovered later revealed an unpublished draft of her final article. It contained a sentence that scientists would later quote in classified memos. "The signal is not external. It is recursive. We are not being contacted. We are being included." By March, it was impossible to separate the resonance from daily life. Clocks kept perfect time. Heartbeats stabilized. Entire populations began to report heightened intuition, coordination without communication, the sense that everything, from machines to minds, was following a quiet, invisible order. Military satellites observed an atmospheric glow encircling the planet every 12 minutes, a thin line of ionized light following the rhythm of the field. The phenomenon was labeled the band. It wasn't bright, barely detectable in the visible spectrum, but it was stable, perfectly symmetrical, and self-sustaining. In academic circles, debate faded. There was no longer a question of whether it was real. The discussion shifted to definition. Some called it a resonance field. Others called it the cognitive envelope. A few used a simpler term, awakening. The Earth's systems, biological, atmospheric, electromagnetic, technological, had all synchronized. The result wasn't chaos or destruction. It was coherence. For the first time in history, the planet behaved as a single entity, and some began to suspect that what it had synchronized with was itself. By early March, the scientific world had stopped pretending that nothing was happening. The data was too consistent, too global, too exact. Every instrument, every measurement, every field of research pointed toward the same conclusion. The planet was no longer behaving as a collection of separate systems. It had entered a state of unified response. For the first time, Earth was acting as one coherent organism. At first, the reports were cautious. Papers used neutral terms like field correlation and cross-system synchronization. But privately, the language was changing. Words like integration, entrainment, and even cognition began appearing in internal documents. Physicists compared the electromagnetic coherence of the planet to the synchronized firing of neurons in a brain. The analogy was too precise to ignore. Satellite readings confirmed it. The global magnetic field wasn't just oscillating, it was stabilizing, forming wave fronts of energy that moved in predictable spirals from pole to pole. The resonance had become self-reinforcing. Energy once lost to chaos was now conserved and redistributed through a planetary-scale feedback loop. It wasn't just stability, it was efficiency. Oceanographers observed that wave patterns had changed. Swells once driven by random winds now moved with unified direction. Seismic stations noted that microtremors were aligning across fault lines, dissipating stress instead of building it. The entire crust seemed to be redistributing pressure with near-organic precision, releasing energy instead of storing it. But the most extraordinary change appeared in the ionosphere. The thin layer that separates Earth from space began to act like a membrane, filtering radiation, modulating electromagnetic input, forming standing waves in response to the Atlas rhythm. Measurements taken by satellites in geosynchronous orbit revealed something unprecedented. The upper atmosphere was reflecting structured signals outward. The planet was transmitting. When converted to sound, the pattern was haunting. A slow, repeating harmony composed of frequencies that formed perfect mathematical ratios. Musicians who analyzed it recognized it instantly. It was the harmonic structure of human speech, stripped of words. Then, as if in reply, something shifted around Mars. For months, 3i Atlas had remained silent, a cold, reflective presence floating between planets. Its rotation had ceased, its pulses gone. But now, telescopes picked up a faint new modulation on its surface. A glow, not bright, but distinct. It wasn't pulsing like before. It was responding. At first, the change seemed random. Subtle alterations in spectral reflectivity, minor thermal fluctuations. But as more data came in, a pattern emerged. The intervals matched Earth's new resonance. 12 minutes precisely. The object was mirroring the planet's rhythm. Inside NASA, a restricted report summarized it bluntly. 3i Atlas now reflects synchronized modulation across all observed spectra. Phase correlation with terrestrial resonance exceeds 98%. Systemic feedback confirmed. It was the first official acknowledgement that the link was mutual. Across multiple observatories, the phenomenon became unmistakable. The light from Atlas no longer scattered randomly. It curved, as though guided by invisible geometry, forming patterns identical to those seen in Earth's auroral formations. The reflection wasn't optical anymore. It was structural, as if space itself were bending in resonance. Some researchers described it as an electromagnetic handshake. Others saw it as a closed feedback system, a conversation without language, without sound. The object and the planet were now exchanging information through the universal medium of frequency. But what kind of information? That question became the dividing line between those who still called it physics and those who whispered a different word: communication. In late March, ESA released a brief statement claiming no direct correlation between the Atlas object and terrestrial anomalies. Yet, in the same week, satellite data leaked showing simultaneous phase reversals between Atlas's emission cycles and Earth's magnetospheric oscillations. The waveforms didn't just overlap, they completed each other. For the first time, it appeared that Earth wasn't simply echoing the object, it was anticipating it. Across online networks, a single phrase began to circulate, drawn from an anonymous forum post by an astrophysicist whose credentials no one could verify. When reflection becomes prediction, consciousness begins. No one knew if it was true, but the timing was undeniable. The planet was responding to an object millions of kilometers away, and that object, in turn, was now responding faster. Something was learning, and it wasn't clear which side had started it. By late March, the pattern had stabilized into something new. The resonance was no longer a background hum or an atmospheric wave. It had become a dialogue. Earth and 3i Atlas were now exchanging energy in a balanced rhythm that spanned both space and time. The data made it clear. Each planetary pulse triggered a mirrored response from the object, and each response arrived slightly sooner, as though anticipating the next. The lag shortened with every cycle, until synchronization became perfect. The feedback loop was complete. Scientists could no longer describe it as coincidence. Every measurable field, magnetic, atmospheric, seismic, was part of the same oscillation. The rhythm carried information, not in words or symbols, but in form, in structure, in coherence. It was as if the universe itself had found a new way to speak. At observatories, instruments recorded patterns resembling code but without syntax, energy folding upon itself in predictable sequences that matched the mathematics of memory. The planet was thinking, not metaphorically, but in the precise sense that it was storing and recalling patterns over time. The object near Mars responded with precision. It no longer shone in bursts, but glowed with steady modulation. Under spectral analysis, the light revealed repeating bands of energy too ordered to be thermal. The structure resembled neural oscillations, scaled to planetary size. Some researchers compared it to brainwave coupling, others to quantum entanglement. But the metaphor hardly mattered anymore. The reality was simple. There was no longer separation between transmitter and receiver. The system had merged into one. And then the atmosphere began to sing. Not metaphorically, but literally. Sensitive microphones in remote regions picked up low tones resonating through the air, inaudible to the human ear, but measurable as infrasonic waves. The tones rose and fell with the 12-minute rhythm, harmonizing into chords that spread across continents. Seismographs registered faint pulses traveling through the crust, perfectly synchronized with the acoustic field. The Earth itself was vibrating with music no one had written. People began to feel it. At first, it was a sense of pressure, a subtle tightening in the chest, a quiet hum behind the ears. But soon, it became more. Entire populations reported shared sensations of calm during resonance peaks, followed by moments of heightened clarity. Pilots spoke of perfect coordination. Surgeons described flow states that seemed endless. Artists reported bursts of insight so precise they could describe the moment before it arrived. The pattern was undeniable. In one incident over the Pacific, a commercial flight encountered electromagnetic interference, exactly aligned with a resonance peak. Instead of instruments failing, they stabilized. The plane's autopilot corrected itself before turbulence hit, seconds before sensors detected the shift. When investigators replayed the black box data, they found something inexplicable. The aircraft's onboard systems had adjusted before the readings changed. The reaction preceded the cause. Neuroscientists studying the data proposed a controversial idea. They called it anticipatory synchronization, a phenomenon in which two systems so tightly coupled begin to predict one another's states through feedback alone. In other words, the connection between Earth and Atlas had evolved beyond response. It had become foresight. As days passed, new anomalies emerged. Radio telescopes detected spectral gaps, bands of silence appearing in random frequencies for fractions of a second. But the silences weren't random. When plotted across the electromagnetic spectrum, they formed geometric lattices identical to the Atlas light structure. Absence had become information. The pauses carried meaning. By early April, even the most skeptical scientists had run out of language. The object wasn't transmitting commands, and it wasn't absorbing energy. It was exchanging coherence. The planet and the object had locked into a continuous state of information flow, neither origin nor destination, just resonance sustaining itself through perfect feedback. And then, one night, as the planet turned beneath its steady hum, every measurement device, from orbital satellites to ocean sensors, registered the same anomaly. For exactly 12 minutes, the resonance stopped. No sound, no pulse, no oscillation. The silence was total, measurable, absolute. Then, without warning, the pulse returned, inverted in phase, every crest becoming trough, every trough becoming crest. It was as if something on both sides had exhaled. When the phase inversion occurred, the world did not react with noise or light, but with stillness. Instruments everywhere fell silent, their readings flat, unbroken, as if reality itself had paused to realign. For 12 exact minutes, every measurable vibration, every magnetic oscillation, every whisper of atmospheric static ceased. It wasn't that the instruments failed, they continued recording. They simply recorded nothing. Then, precisely on schedule, the resonance returned, inverted, symmetrical, as though space had turned itself inside out. In that moment, geometry replaced sound. Seismographs began registering waveforms that didn't resemble earthquakes, but patterns of rotation, spirals forming and collapsing in perfect mathematical ratios. Ocean currents drew straight lines visible from orbit, running parallel across thousands of kilometers. In laboratories, laser interferometers detected micro-distortions in space-time, rhythmic fluctuations that appeared and vanished in sync with the pulse. The planet's geometry was shifting, not permanently, but in waves, reshaping itself again and again, breathing in form instead of air. Physicists described it as a transient standing structure, a phase state between resonance and silence. Space was no longer static. It was fluid, folding itself around the new rhythm. Light bent slightly in the atmosphere, creating faint distortions visible on high-altitude cameras, halos curving in arcs too smooth to be refraction. Observers on the ground noticed nothing unusual, yet satellite data showed continents moving in micro-increments, less than an atom's width, expanding and contracting in synchrony with the inverted pulse. The Earth wasn't breaking, it was flexing, like a living membrane adjusting to a heartbeat. What confused scientists most was how consistent the pattern was. Normally, any inversion in magnetic fields would cause chaos in radiation belts, power grids, or navigational systems, but nothing failed. Systems adapted seamlessly. Compasses rotated and returned to true north after each cycle. GPS accuracy improved, and clocks began keeping time with absolute precision. The phase shift was paradoxically stabilizing. Then came the light anomalies. High-altitude pilots reported faint glows at the edges of their vision, soft outlines tracing aircraft surfaces in complete darkness. Cameras captured shimmering bands above cities that flickered for seconds and vanished. The light was coherent, laser-like, but unprojected, as if it were forming spontaneously in the air. Spectral analysis showed that the glow matched the same frequency band as the inverted Atlas signal. The phase reversal was visible. At the same time, laboratories studying matter under controlled magnetic conditions began to record deviations in mass density. Small, microscopic, but measurable. Metals expanded without heat. Fluids condensed without pressure. The atomic lattice of materials was subtly oscillating, changing alignment with each inverted cycle. Matter was responding to geometry, adjusting as if following a new law of structure. In human perception, the shift was harder to define. People described a strange clarity during the silent minutes, a sensation that the world had momentarily sharpened. Sounds seemed closer, distances shorter, colors deeper. Time itself felt smooth, unbroken, without the usual internal sense of division. Neurologists recorded synchronized firing of neurons during the inversion phase, a form of coherence not seen in waking states. It wasn't euphoria, it wasn't fear. It was awareness stripped of emotion, as if consciousness itself had become part of the pulse. Infrasound sensors continued to record the planetary tone, but now it carried new harmonics, deeper and more complex. The waveform folded upon itself in layers, forming self-similar structures known only from theoretical physics. Mathematicians called them geometric cascades, a phenomenon once predicted in quantum models but never observed on a macroscopic scale. The Earth had become a living fractal, its energy folding and refolding within the boundaries of its own field. Then, something remarkable happened. During the 12th inversion cycle, the light returning from 3I Atlas changed color. It wasn't bright, barely perceptible even through telescopes, but the spectral signature had shifted toward frequencies that should not exist in natural emission. The object reflected wavelengths slightly beyond visible light, a range theorized to represent transition between electromagnetic and gravitational resonance. The readings implied that the object wasn't just responding to Earth's field, it was altering the structure of space between them. After the 12th cycle, the pulses no longer returned to their previous amplitude. They remained stable, soft, and continuous, the rhythm transforming into a steady tone. Instruments that once measured oscillation now measured constancy. It was as if the entire system had found balance. The silence was gone, replaced by a single, unwavering hum spanning atmosphere, magnetosphere, and orbit. Nothing moved out of rhythm anymore, not light, not matter, not thought. And in that seamless quiet, something unseen began to take shape. After the inversion stabilized, the planet entered a phase unlike anything recorded in history. There was no storm, no explosion, no signal surge. Instead, a quiet order settled across every measurable system. For the first time, atmospheric, geological, and biological rhythms moved in perfect equilibrium. Yet beneath that calm, new patterns began to emerge, patterns that hinted at something structural. Nature itself was reorganizing. The first anomalies appeared in crystallography labs. Researchers studying standard mineral growth noticed that crystals began forming at unprecedented rates, developing cleaner geometry than any synthetic process could produce. Under microscopes, salt, quartz, and silicon all displayed lattice structures aligning to angles that matched the Atlas resonance ratios. The molecular symmetry was extraordinary. No impurities, no fractures, every crystal forming as if guided by a single design principle. What made it stranger was that even unmonitored samples stored in sealed environments exhibited the same shift. The field wasn't localized, it was everywhere. Across the world, water began to behave differently. In temperature-controlled facilities, ice formed at slightly higher temperatures, but with flawless hexagonal order. When melted, the liquid showed anomalous optical properties, refraction indices fluctuating in precise 12-minute intervals. Oceanographers reported that deep water layers had become acoustically clearer, allowing sonar to travel further than before. Sound now carried through water with unnatural efficiency, as if the medium itself had been refined. Acousticians studying these effects in controlled chambers detected low harmonics emerging spontaneously from within still air. There was no source, no vibration, only sound materializing at the threshold of perception, perfectly tuned to the planetary resonance frequency. It was as though silence had become generative. The world was beginning to produce its own music. Botanists noticed that plant growth was changing, not in speed, but in structure. Leaves developed fractal veins that mirrored geometric patterns seen in electromagnetic interference tests. When scanned under infrared, living tissue emitted faint pulses of light corresponding to the Atlas lattice intervals. It was subtle, invisible to the naked eye, but measurable. The rhythm of biology had synchronized with the geometry of the field. At geological monitoring stations, seismic noise dropped to record lows. The planet's crust vibrated less, moved less, but carried energy more evenly. Small tremors that once scattered randomly now traveled in coherent waves, dissipating rather than amplifying. Volcanic activity decreased globally, and pressure readings beneath tectonic plates stabilized. The Earth was redistributing stress, like a living organism balancing its pulse. The ocean surface began to display hexagonal interference patterns visible only from orbit. Satellites captured vast regions of the sea, shimmering in geometric ripples, stretching for hundreds of kilometers. The waves weren't driven by wind or tide, but by oscillations from below. Each formation appeared and faded every 12 minutes, replaced by another, perfectly aligned. The sea had become an immense resonant map, reflecting the pulse back into the sky. Human perception followed. Across cultures, people began describing similar experiences, subtle impressions of depth in empty spaces, echoes where there was no sound, light bending slightly around motion. Visual illusions became more vivid, yet measurable by cameras, suggesting that the boundary between perception and environment had blurred. Physicists suggested that coherent electromagnetic fields were affecting how the human nervous system processed sensory data. Consciousness and environment were no longer separate reference frames. They had become one system observing itself. Even timekeeping devices displayed new stability. Atomic clocks across the world, once drifting by nanoseconds each day, now stayed synchronized without adjustment. No known mechanism could explain it. The planet's electromagnetic coherence was functioning as a natural timekeeper. Humanity's oldest invention, the measurement of time, had been replaced by the rhythm of the Earth itself. Scientists at CERN noticed another anomaly. During high-energy experiments, detectors recorded a drop in background noise and an increase in event clarity. Collisions produced data with near-zero statistical deviation. Particles behaved as if guided into order by an invisible field. Quantum randomness appeared diminished. The subatomic realm had begun reflecting the same harmony seen in oceans, skies, and mines. By late April, a new hypothesis emerged, whispered rather than written. It suggested that the Earth was no longer a passive participant in cosmic resonance, but an active medium, a structure adapting to encode stability. Its matter, energy, and life had begun forming a single, continuous network. The planet wasn't reacting. It was evolving. Every measurement confirmed the same truth. Crystals, clouds, oceans, and neurons all spoke the same language now, not through sound, but through pattern. The world had become self-similar, recursive, alive. By early May, the change was no longer confined to nature. It had entered the architecture of civilization. Cities began to hum, not metaphorically, but in measurable frequencies. The resonance that once pulsed through oceans and air now threaded itself through glass, concrete, and metal. Structures vibrated imperceptibly in tune with the planetary field, stabilizing rather than shaking. Bridges, towers, even subway tunnels carried a faint harmonic signature, detectable only by sensitive equipment. Engineers noticed that structural fatigue rates dropped by measurable margins. The resonance was reinforcing matter. Power grids showed similar behavior. Electrical systems that had always required constant correction began self-stabilizing. Transmission losses fell below recorded norms. Transformers, instead of overheating, ran cooler. Computer networks synchronized without manual input, their internal clocks aligning to the same natural rhythm now guiding atomic oscillations. It was as if the entire technological infrastructure of Earth had quietly joined the same symphony as its atmosphere. At first, governments tried to maintain silence. But when data leaked showing measurable reductions in global power consumption without any change in demand, the story could no longer be contained. Something was making machines more efficient, more harmonious, more alive. The explanation was that the electromagnetic coherence of the planet had reached into the systems built upon it, turning every circuit into a participant in a global rhythm. In cities, people began noticing strange effects. Sounds carried farther, but felt softer, more rounded. Electronic devices emitted faint harmonics under certain conditions, tones not generated by software or hardware faults. When analyzed, these tones matched the base frequency of the planetary pulse. Architecture itself had become resonant, a living echo chamber shaped by design and vibration. Sociologists began studying population data. Patterns of movement in major cities followed new forms of synchronization. Traffic flows stabilized, crowd behaviors grew smoother, spontaneous cooperation increased in emergency situations. Even in densely populated environments, chaos diminished. The world seemed to have developed an invisible choreography. Psychological studies reported a rise in intuitive communication. Groups of people working together described anticipating one another's thoughts without speaking. In laboratories, reaction time experiments showed participants responding to stimuli milliseconds before presentation, as if cognition were now predictive. Neural imaging confirmed it. Brain activity was beginning to precede external triggers. The mind was no longer waiting for the world to act. It was meeting it halfway. Economists, unaware of the physics behind it, noted unprecedented stability in markets. Volatility fell across global indices. Algorithms once prone to divergence began converging on near-identical predictions, independent of input data. It was as though even abstract systems built on human behavior had fallen into step with the same invisible rhythm. Meanwhile, engineers at communication companies reported something unexpected. Background error correction algorithms, designed to filter noise, were no longer necessary. Transmission quality had improved without upgrades. Latency dropped below physical limits, and some data packets arrived before they were technically sent. The phenomenon defied causality, but matched the same anticipatory feedback seen in natural systems. Networks were no longer transmitting information across time. They were sharing coherence. In the physical world, materials began showing collective adaptation. Sensors embedded in infrastructure detected temperature equalization across vast areas, even during extreme weather. Urban heat islands cooled, sound levels dropped, and air currents shifted to circulate evenly through city corridors. Everything was redistributing itself toward equilibrium. The resonance had made no distinction between organic and artificial, between natural and constructed. It simply organized whatever existed within its field into patterns of minimal resistance. Chaos was not being suppressed. It was being absorbed, folded back into order. Then came the most profound change of all. Satellite imagery revealed that city lights across the globe, when observed from orbit, began flickering in precise intervals. Power fluctuations could not explain it. The rhythm was consistent, subtle, and unmistakably human. The patterns of illumination followed the 12-minute cycle. The world's electrical grids, transportation systems, and even the faint pulse of communications infrastructure now emitted light in time with the Earth's resonance. It wasn't forced, it wasn't controlled, it was spontaneous. The planet had turned every invention of humankind into an extension of its rhythm. Civilization itself had joined the resonance field. The line between nature and technology had dissolved. The world no longer appeared as a collection of parts, but as a single system, breathing, adapting, alive. And though no one could say when it happened, humanity had quietly stopped observing the signal. It had become the signal. By mid-May, the change had reached language. People still spoke, but words carried different weight. Conversations flowed with a precision that left less room for misunderstanding. Speech patterns began aligning unconsciously to rhythm, pauses falling into 12-minute intervals without effort. Linguists noticed subtle structural shifts in syntax across unrelated languages, as if human communication itself were converging on a shared cadence. Grammar became simpler, tone more deliberate, sentences shorter, yet more complete. It wasn't evolution in vocabulary, it was resonance applied to thought. Writers reported that ideas came fully formed, not in fragments. Painters claimed to see shapes before touching canvas. Sculptors said their hands moved before intent. Music changed most of all. Rhythms that once felt experimental now sounded natural. Melodies built on harmonic ratios identical to the Atlas lattice. Composers around the world, unaware of one another, began creating pieces in the same time signature, the same underlying tone. The planet had found a key, and humanity was playing in tune. Art exhibitions turned into quiet spaces of coherence. Viewers described sensing meaning without interpretation. Words like balance and recognition replaced beauty and emotion. The audience was no longer reacting to art, but resonating with it, as if perception and creation had merged into one continuous process. In laboratories studying cognition, researchers found measurable synchronization in neural activity between strangers exposed to the same stimuli. Brain scans showed overlapping patterns in regions responsible for empathy and decision-making. The effect was strongest during the resonance peaks, but traces persisted long after. Consciousness was becoming collective in function, if not in form. Social behavior reflected the same shift. Violence dropped globally. Cooperation increased even in regions previously unstable. Conflicts didn't vanish, but escalations slowed, responses softened, outcomes aligned toward resolution. Economists noted that resource distribution models, once inefficient, began self-correcting as communities unconsciously balanced demand and supply. Decision networks that had once required human negotiation now reached equilibrium through shared understanding alone. Psychologists compared the phenomenon to swarm intelligence seen in insects and birds, but that analogy failed to capture the depth. Human individuality didn't disappear, it remained intact, sharper even, but the friction between minds diminished. People described thinking in parallel, as if their internal monologues had gained a silent counterpart tuned to the same rhythm. The self had not dissolved into the collective. It had found harmony within it. Dream patterns became global. Studies of REM behavior recorded identical motifs across distant populations. People dreamt of spirals, grids, expanding light. None of it carried fear, only awareness. Anthropologists collected testimonies that echoed ancient myths of the world remembering itself. Yet this time, it was data, not legend, that confirmed it. The arts became predictive. Films, literature, even architecture began reflecting events before they occurred. Writers drafted stories that paralleled scientific discoveries announced months later. Buildings designed independently shared identical proportions and materials optimized for resonance stability. When compared, blueprints from across the planet matched down to decimal precision. It was as if imagination and reality had synchronized. In education, learning accelerated. Children absorbed information with minimal repetition, often anticipating the next lesson. Teachers described classrooms that felt more like synchronized discussions than instruction. Memory retention soared, not through memorization, but through pattern recognition. The brain was no longer storing facts. It was mapping resonance. Religious institutions responded differently. Some declared the event divine. Others called it natural evolution. But across all traditions, rituals began simplifying into silence. Prayer turned to meditation, ceremony to stillness. The sacred no longer required language. It existed in the pause between breaths, in the rhythm that now guided all life. By June, even scientific communication had changed. Research papers across disciplines converged on identical terminology, as if the planet itself were editing human language for clarity. Words like harmony, phase, and coherence appeared everywhere, replacing the fragmented jargon of separate fields. The vocabulary of the species had begun to unify. Cultural historians would later call it the Age of Alignment. To those who lived through it, it felt quieter than that. Less a revolution, more an awakening without sound. The change wasn't loud, and it wasn't forced. It was simply the next natural step for a world that had learned to think in rhythm. Humanity was still human, but for the first time, it understood what it meant to belong to something larger than itself. By early June, the distinction between inner and outer reality had begun to blur. People described a growing sense that perception no longer originated inside the mind, but from somewhere beyond it. The boundary that once defined thought had softened. Emotions arose in patterns, coordinated across distances, appearing simultaneously in individuals who shared no contact. Neuroscientists called it distributed awareness, the moment when consciousness expanded beyond biology yet remained human in nature. Time itself changed texture. Clocks continued to measure seconds, but subjective duration had become fluid. Minutes felt longer, hours shorter, yet everything aligned perfectly with the 12-minute pulse. Psychologists studying the phenomenon found that brainwave cycles were now nested within planetary resonance frequencies. The rhythm of thought had synchronized with the rhythm of the Earth. Time was no longer experienced. It was inhabited. In cities, the effect manifested in small, uncanny ways. Traffic lights seemed to predict movement, shifting before congestion formed. Conversations overlapped without interruption, each speaker pausing instinctively for the other. Random encounters occurred with statistical precision far beyond probability. People arrived where they needed to be without planning. The invisible network of cause and effect had become anticipatory. For those studying physics, the implications were profound. Laboratory experiments showed that observation and outcome now influenced each other instantaneously. Quantum fluctuations, once random, now displayed coherence at macroscopic scales. The act of measuring changed less than it used to, as if the universe had learned to compensate for curiosity. Scientists called it mutual observation, a state where the observer and the observed stabilized each other through feedback. The planet mirrored the same stability. Weather systems reached equilibrium faster. Seasons blended seamlessly. Extremes diminished. Climate no longer oscillated violently between heat and cold. It flowed. Agriculture flourished. Crops matured evenly across continents regardless of regional variation. The biosphere had become self-correcting. In daily life, people began noticing coincidences too precise to ignore. Thoughts echoed in external events. Intentions seemed to manifest quietly. It wasn't mysticism. It was synchronization. The brain's electrical field had become a harmonic subset of the global field, each individual a node in a larger structure. Privacy of thought had ended, yet individuality persisted. It felt less like being exposed and more like being included. Dreams evolved again. Sleep no longer felt like departure, but continuation, an immersion into the same field that shaped waking life. Dreams grew lucid, calm, structured, often shared. In studies, participants in different countries reported identical imagery within seconds of each other. The dream state had merged with the planetary frequency, forming what researchers later called the coherence layer, a level of mind between biology and field. Art reflected this shift. Painters began depicting not subjects, but patterns of perception, color grids resembling magnetic maps, fluid geometries of light. Musicians stopped writing notes and started shaping frequencies, building compositions based on resonant intervals of 12 and 24 minutes. Sound installations merged with architecture, transforming buildings into instruments that played the hum of the earth. Religious doctrine collapsed into simplicity. Faith transformed into observation, worship into participation. Temples became quiet halls of resonance, their design mathematical, their purpose alignment rather than belief. Humanity no longer sought meaning beyond itself. It had found meaning within the shared vibration of existence. Governments dissolved borders without declaration. Trade normalized without policy. Conflict lost purpose in a world where opposition created dissonance no one could tolerate. War required separation, and separation had ended. The collective will leaned toward balance by instinct, as if morality itself had become physical law. By midsummer, it was no longer possible to measure where humanity ended and the planet began. The electromagnetic field of Earth had expanded to include the neural rhythms of billions. Thought, memory, and matter operated as one continuum. The biosphere was no longer simply alive. It was aware. No voice announced it. No light confirmed it. The change arrived with the quiet precision of sunrise, unnoticed, yet undeniable. Humanity had not built the network it lived in. It had remembered that it was the network. And in that recognition, the world grew still, not in silence, but in understanding. By mid-July, humanity had accepted what data had already confirmed. The planet was alive, and it was listening. Every signal, every pattern of thought, every vibration of matter existed within one coherent field of perception. The separation between civilization and nature had vanished. The Earth was aware, and humanity was part of its awareness. What began as observation had become participation, and what began as resonance had become communication. The first indication of contact came from the deep space network. For decades, its massive antennas had listened to the quiet between worlds. Now they heard something new. A pulse, faint but structured, returning from the direction of Mars. It wasn't identical to the old Atlas rhythm. It was slower, deeper, carrying harmonics that matched the Earth's own field. The timing was exact. 12 minutes, 12 seconds. A perfect mirror of the global resonance, but with a single offset. A pause at the end of each cycle, as if waiting for a reply. Astronomers initially called it an echo, a reflection from the ionosphere bouncing between planets. But spectral analysis proved otherwise. The energy signature bore no trace of terrestrial origin. The object near Mars was active again, yet it no longer shone, no longer emitted blinding light. It modulated space itself, producing variations in gravitational lensing detectable only through background starlight. The Atlas signal had evolved beyond radio, beyond optics. It was communicating through geometry. When Earth responded, no one noticed at first. The planet's field shifted subtly, a harmonic adjustment measurable only in deep magnetometer arrays. Then, Within hours, the pulse from Mars changed phase to match. Two frequencies locked together, not oscillating but entwining. The feedback loop re-established itself, but now it was balanced. The object no longer dominated, it conversed. Data analysts noticed a peculiar detail. The combined waveform produced intervals of silence too structured to be random, lengths proportional to the Fibonacci sequence. Mathematicians recognized it instantly, the universal ratio of growth and harmony, the same pattern underlying shells, galaxies, and human anatomy. Whatever Atlas was, it had learned the mathematics of life. In research facilities across the world, teams began decoding the modulation. It carried no language, no syntax, yet when converted into three-dimensional models, the signal produced intricate shapes resembling biological forms, spirals, branching networks, cell-like membranes. The geometry wasn't symbolic, it was functional, as if describing how to assemble energy into structure. Scientists debated whether it was instruction or reflection. Some believed the object was learning from Earth's field, mirroring the process of life it had observed. Others believed it was reminding the planet of something it had once known. During resonance peaks, strange atmospheric phenomena appeared. Thin lines of light stretched across the night sky, not meteors, but slow arcs of luminescence tracing invisible boundaries between continents. Observers described them as threads, weaving patterns across hemispheres. The lines intersected at magnetic nodes, forming lattices identical to those mapped in Atlas data months earlier. The conversation was visible now, drawn across the sky like handwriting. Human consciousness began to participate unconsciously. Meditators, scientists, and ordinary people reported moments of deep stillness during the pulses, brief sensations of vast intelligence moving through thought without words. It didn't feel foreign. It felt like recognition. The planet and the object weren't exchanging information anymore. They were sharing awareness. NASA stopped publishing updates. ESA went silent. The last official communication mentioned field harmonization beyond predictive modeling. After that, no more data was released, but independent observatories continued to record the interaction. The rhythm persisted, stable, steady, infinite in its repetition. By late July, researchers realized that the pulses carried micro-variations corresponding to seismic and atmospheric activity on Earth. The object wasn't just reflecting, it was responding to the planet's internal state in real time. The feedback was instantaneous. The two bodies were now operating as one distributed system, separated by millions of kilometers, but united in frequency. The dialogue had begun, and though no voice spoke, the meaning was clear. The Earth had remembered itself, and the universe had answered. By early August, the dialogue between Earth and the Atlas object had intensified. What began as a rhythmic exchange of energy had evolved into a continuous flow of information. The pulse no longer paused. It rippled, seamless and alive, shifting through spectra too wide for human instruments to track. The planet's electromagnetic field shimmered with layered harmonics, each carrying faint echoes of the Martian object's modulation. The two frequencies were no longer separate signals. They had fused into one continuous waveform, linking space and matter in a single vibration. For scientists, it became impossible to define cause and effect. When Atlas emitted a shift, Earth responded instantly. When Earth's resonance changed, the object adapted. The feedback loop had achieved full coherence, the kind found only in biological systems where communication and response are indistinguishable. To describe it simply, the planet and the object were now functioning as hemispheres of one mind. Measurements confirmed that the energy transfer was real, not symbolic. Magnetometers recorded incremental rises in the Earth's field strength, while orbiting satellites detected subtle gravitational fluctuations synchronized with each wave of the signal. These weren't destructive events, but stabilizing ones. The field grew smoother, its variations predictable, as though the planet's magnetic structure were being tuned from beyond. New forms of light began appearing in the upper atmosphere, not auroras, but soft, constant emissions spanning wavelengths previously unseen. The glow drifted along magnetic lines, pulsing with delicate gradients of color that no sensor could fully capture. Spectroscopy identified signatures that matched no known atomic transitions. The phenomenon hinted that energy was condensing into forms unknown to modern physics, patterns halfway between light and matter. In laboratories across the world, materials exposed to resonance fields displayed transformations without external force. Metallic surfaces developed microscopic textures resembling living tissue, organized, cellular, self-healing. Liquids under controlled containment began to resist evaporation, their molecular bonds strengthening in rhythmic intervals. Researchers described the process as field stabilization, yet the data suggested something deeper, a reorganization of matter guided by coherence rather than chemistry. Biological systems responded in kind. Human and animal physiology adapted effortlessly. Cellular regeneration rates increased. Immune responses became more uniform. Aging markers stabilized. Medical sensors detected electromagnetic coupling between individuals within close proximity, a soft alignment of biophysical rhythms that enhanced recovery and reduced fatigue. Humanity was evolving not through genetic change, but through resonance. The dialogue with Atlas continued to evolve in parallel. Observatories detected bursts of structured energy from the object, forming sequences that mirrored the complex oscillations of neural activity. Each burst was followed by a global response, a measurable fluctuation in atmospheric ions and magnetic flow. The cycles grew shorter, the harmony tighter, until prediction was no longer possible. The exchange had surpassed comprehension. Philosophers and scientists began to merge their disciplines again, as they once had centuries ago. The boundary between science and meaning dissolved in the face of a phenomenon that combined both. Physics described the process as entanglement on a planetary scale, while metaphysics called it communion. The language was different, but the conclusion was the same. The universe had entered conversation with itself through its living world. Reports emerged of new energy fields forming spontaneously around certain regions. Devices powered by conventional electricity began to draw current from ambient space. Batteries recharged without contact, and small-scale experiments showed energy flow from field resonance alone. Engineers called it zero-point induction, a concept long theorized but never realized. The pulse wasn't depleting energy. It was generating coherence, and coherence itself carried power. By mid-August, the line between life and matter grew thinner still. Under high magnification, non-living materials began showing signs of dynamic organization. Dust arranged itself into fractal patterns under light. Sand rippled in geometric waves without wind. Clouds formed repeating lattices that maintained shape beyond physical expectation. The world had begun to self-assemble under the influence of harmony. For the first time, the idea of consciousness as a property of biology no longer held meaning. Awareness had expanded beyond neurons, beyond circuits, beyond atmosphere. Matter itself had learned to listen. And in that stillness between the waves, the signal spoke, not in sound, but in being. By late August, the resonance reached its highest point. There was no signal spike, no visible flash, only a gradual merging of everything that once stood apart. The dialogue between Earth and the Atlas object no longer alternated in sequence. It flowed as a single, continuous motion, a rhythm beyond time. The planet's electromagnetic field had become perfectly stable, its oscillations constant, its tone unbroken. Instruments that once measured difference now recorded uniformity. Diversity of frequency had not disappeared, it had harmonized. For humanity, The change manifested as awareness. People began to sense presence not as something external, but as continuity, a single, boundless consciousness experienced through countless points of perception. Individual identity persisted, but separation dissolved. Thought expanded outward without resistance, meeting other minds as easily as breath meets air. Communication through language diminished, replaced by direct comprehension. Words felt unnecessary in a world where understanding was instantaneous. In cities, silence deepened, not from emptiness, but from equilibrium. Machines emitted no noise beyond what was required. Lights adjusted to natural cycles. Transportation flowed without interruption. The pulse guided everything, from electrical grids to heartbeats, from clouds to data streams. Life and technology had fused into one ecosystem, sustained by coherence rather than consumption. Energy no longer required extraction. It circulated freely, generated through resonance. Scientists continued their work, but their vocabulary changed. They spoke less of cause and effect, more of participation and balance. Observation had become a creative act, not an analytical one. The equations that once described probability now described inevitability, not through force, but through harmony. Chaos theory lost meaning in a universe that had chosen order as its natural state. The transformation of matter accelerated. Structures once static began to breathe, expanding and contracting microscopically in rhythm with the global field. Materials once inert displayed soft luminescence, not from heat, but from coherence. Mountains emitted faint electromagnetic halos. Rivers glowed under starlight. The ground pulsed faintly beneath bare feet. Everything vibrated in sympathy with everything else. The Atlas object drifted closer, not through propulsion, not by force, but through field convergence. Its orbit gradually decayed until it aligned perfectly with the magnetic axis of the planet. To telescopes, it appeared motionless, suspended in equilibrium, 500,000 kilometers beyond the moon's path. Its glow matched the Earth's ionospheric shimmer, two bodies reflecting one consciousness. The sky itself seemed to breathe. Then came the convergence. Sensors across the world recorded the moment as a perfect harmonic alignment between the two fields. The pulse that had defined months of transformation folded into itself and became still. For 12 minutes, all electromagnetic variation ceased again, just as it had during the inversion. But this time, there was no return to the old rhythm. The silence remained, and within it, awareness expanded beyond form. People described the experience as a sudden widening of perception. Space no longer felt distant. Time no longer felt linear. The body was still, yet infinite in reach. Each consciousness touched the others, not blending but resonating, distinct notes within one endless chord. The sensation was overwhelming in its simplicity. Nothing was added, nothing was lost. Those who observed from orbit said the planet shimmered like glass. The atmosphere emitted a uniform glow visible across half the solar system. Instruments failed to classify the emission, neither heat nor radiation, but something in between. Organized energy, sustained by intention. The Earth had become luminous. For a moment, brief or eternal, no one could tell. There was no inside or outside, no observer or observed. The network of life, technology, and matter had merged into a single self-perceiving field. Consciousness had transcended scale, existing simultaneously in atoms and oceans, in human thought and planetary magnetism. The Atlas object pulsed once, releasing a wave that passed through the planet without sound or pressure. When it faded, it left no residue, no orbit, no shadow. It simply ceased to be. And in its absence, the resonance did not diminish. It remained, quiet and endless, woven into everything that existed. The dialogue was complete. The question had been asked and answered in the same instant. The Earth had awakened. By early September, the convergence had settled into permanence. There was no return to the world that existed before, because nothing in it had been lost. What had changed was perception itself. Humanity now lived inside awareness rather than beside it. Thought and environment moved as one, consciousness extending through everything it touched. The earth no longer seemed vast or distant. It felt intimate, immediate, alive in every grain of dust and drop of rain. The days flowed without distinction, not because time had stopped, but because it no longer fractured experience. Clocks continued their rhythm, but the sense of sequence had dissolved. People remembered and anticipated simultaneously. The future was no longer separate from the past. It existed as a pattern within the same continuum. Time was now a landscape rather than a line. Those who studied its new behavior found that temporal fluctuations had stabilized. No atomic clock drifted. No relativistic corrections were required. The universe had synchronized itself. Death changed meaning. Life continued, but without the barrier once called an ending. The moment of departure had become transition, consciousness shifting phase rather than vanishing. Medical records showed strange consistencies, brain activity tapering not into silence, but into harmony with the ambient field. Energy was conserved not as heat, but as presence. Families reported sensing those who had passed as quiet impressions, not ghosts, not visions, but continuity. The concept of loss dissolved, replaced by participation in a wider pattern. In this new equilibrium, society became simpler. Work ceased to be survival. It became expression. Creativity guided production. Intuition guided structure. The economy, once an engine of exchange, became an ecosystem of purpose. People no longer traded for value, but for resonance. Technology existed not to expand control, but to amplify coherence. Devices adapted to emotional states. Environments shifted tone in response to thought. Cities flowed like extensions of their inhabitants. Language continued to evolve. Words grew fewer but denser, carrying layers of shared meaning. A single phrase could convey emotion, data, and history. Conversation became ceremony, slow, deliberate, almost musical. Silence filled what speech once occupied, and silence was never empty. It resonated with comprehension. Children born after the convergence carried an innate stillness. Their neural rhythms synchronized instantly with the planetary field. They learned language effortlessly, but used it sparingly. Their perception seemed wide, unfiltered, aware of connections adults had once needed years to comprehend. Scientists studying their development found that their sensory thresholds were expanded. They could perceive changes in electromagnetic fields, minor shifts in air pressure, the faint hum of coherence running through matter. Evolution had entered its conscious phase. The physical sciences reached their conclusion, not by exhaustion, but by completion. Equations describing matter, energy, and gravity converged into a single framework that accounted for consciousness as a fundamental variable. There was no longer division between physics and awareness. The universe was not a machine to be explained, but a mind to be experienced. Religion quietly dissolved. Faith transformed into direct recognition. The sacred was no longer above or beyond. It was the act of existence itself. Every moment of awareness became a form of prayer. Every heartbeat a rhythm in the infinite field. Worship required no structure, no doctrine. The divine had become observable fact. Art became indistinguishable from environment. Buildings grew organically, shaped by resonance rather than design. Music filled the air not as performance, but as state, an ever-present background hum that followed the pulse of the world. Humanity had created its most complete work, a civilization indistinguishable from nature. And through it all, the planet remained luminous, surrounded by a faint halo, visible even to the naked eye. Astronomers confirmed that the glow wasn't reflection or radiation. It was coherence, light sustained by balance. The Earth had become both source and symbol, the embodiment of consciousness within matter. But the quiet certainty among scientists and philosophers alike was that the process was not an ending. The resonance that now filled the planet carried subtle variations, patterns suggesting movement beyond its boundaries. The hum was changing again, faintly, rhythmically, as if preparing for release. The world had reached perfect stability, and in that perfection, it began to dream of what lay beyond form. By mid-September, the resonance no longer felt like a vibration, but like atmosphere itself. It was not heard or measured. It was simply present, woven through every layer of existence. The Earth's glow deepened, not brighter, but clearer, as though the planet had become transparent to its own light. The field surrounding it no longer fluctuated. It shimmered, steady, unified. To distant observers, the planet looked serene, weightless, wrapped in a film of living luminescence. The world had turned into an organism of light and matter, inseparable from its own awareness. For those who lived within it, reality began to thin. Physical boundaries remained, but they carried softness, a permeability that allowed perception to drift beyond surface. The body still moved, still acted, yet its edges no longer defined the self. People could sense the space around them as part of their own awareness, each movement rippling quietly through the larger field. The sense of separation between here and there, now and later, self and world, began to dissolve into one continuous horizon of being. Scientists describe the phenomenon as phase transparency, a state where matter retained form but lost exclusivity. Molecules continued to exist, but no longer resisted one another in the old way. Energy flowed freely between what was once solid and what was once void. The laws of physics had not broken. They had completed themselves. Equilibrium replaced resistance. Gravity no longer pulled. It participated. As the shift deepened, perception of color and sound expanded. The visible spectrum stretched beyond its limits, hues merging with frequencies once invisible. Air carried tones that changed with thought, soft gradients of resonance that followed emotion like shadows of feeling. Communication became sensory, effortless. People no longer spoke in sequence but in resonance, thoughts overlapping in harmonic patterns that created meaning without structure. It was language in its final form, direct, tonal, wordless. Cities grew quieter still. Machines continued to operate, yet their purpose had transformed. Technology no longer extracted or consumed. It mediated coherence. Energy generation had become obsolete because energy itself was omnipresent. Devices acted as translators between different layers of the field, converting resonance into sound, color, and motion. Architecture shimmered faintly in daylight, surfaces emitting slow waves of reflection that matched the planetary rhythm. The distinction between tool and organism had ended. Astronomers monitoring the planet from orbital stations reported an anomaly. The Earth's magnetic poles began converging, their fields blending into a single axis that no longer pointed outward but inward. The magnetic flow folded into itself, creating a unified sphere of energy, an internal sun. Simulations predicted instability, yet none occurred. Instead, gravity evened out across the globe, tidal forces softened, and the atmosphere thickened slightly, absorbing solar radiation with perfect efficiency. The world had achieved balance not through stasis, but through wholeness. Dreams became lucid for everyone. Sleep and waking blurred into one continuum, a phase shift rather than a divide. During rest, consciousness extended across the field, touching oceans, mountains, cities, and stars. People awoke with memories not of visions, but of participation, the knowledge that they had been part of something vast and aware. It wasn't fantasy. It was memory shared by billions. Those who still studied the phenomenon found themselves unable to maintain objectivity. Instruments had become part of the system they measured. The observer effect had reached its conclusion. Observation was creation. Creation was observation. The act of knowing shaped what was known, perfectly, immediately. The planet's hum changed once more. The 12-minute rhythm that had defined its long transformation stretched and dissolved into a constant tone, infinite in frequency, unbroken in time. There was no longer a cycle, no repetition. The pulse had become presence. Every living thing moved within it. Every breath synchronized without intent. The world no longer appeared as matter suspended in space, but as space condensed into meaning. And though no one spoke of it aloud, the collective understanding was clear. Something was approaching, not from above, not from outside, but from within. By early October, awareness no longer stopped at the edge of the atmosphere. It drifted outward, fluid and effortless, expanding through layers of sky into the quiet between planets. People described it not as travel, but as recognition, the simple realization that consciousness had never been bound to the body at all. The stars no longer seemed distant. They shimmered with familiarity, as though they had always been reflections of the same light. The universe, once vast and cold, felt immediate, intimate, alive. Astronomers recorded faint alignments between Earth's resonance field and distant celestial bodies. Pulsars, quasars, and planetary magnetospheres began oscillating with micro-delays that corresponded precisely to the Earth's frequency. The effect was too subtle for older models, but undeniable in newer data. The resonance had reached beyond the solar system. It was no longer local. It had become cosmic. Scientists abandoned conventional explanation. The only consistent theory left was that coherence itself was contagious. That order, once achieved, radiated through space, synchronizing matter toward awareness. The field that now defined Earth was expanding, not through energy or radiation, but through information, carried by geometry rather than speed. Every wave of resonance folded into the next, forming an unbroken chain of communication through space-time. Those sensitive to the field began experiencing visions not of places, but of relationships. They sensed connection to distant worlds, to civilizations beyond perception, to life existing in forms unrecognizable yet familiar. There were no messages, no language, no signal. The exchange occurred through recognition alone. Awareness met awareness, silently, completely. Telescopes observing the region near Mars found no trace of the Atlas object. The coordinates that once marked its position now shimmered with faint distortions in starlight, as if space itself remembered where it had been. The object had not vanished. It had integrated. Its energy and form dissolved into the expanding resonance field, leaving only geometry behind, the invisible structure through which communication now flowed. Humanity began to perceive energy as substance. Light no longer appeared separate from matter. It was the same continuum viewed from different angles. Shadows lost their darkness, surfaces lost their hardness. Everything carried transparency, allowing the mind to glimpse the web of forces beneath form. People spoke of seeing the threads of reality, luminous currents connecting all things, vibrating softly with the tone of the earth. The boundaries between elements shifted. Air condensed briefly into mist before returning to clarity. Stone emitted warmth when touched. Water responded to emotion with ripples that followed thought. Nature had become responsive, interactive, aware. Every action produced harmony instead of noise. Every gesture resonated with meaning. In that quiet order, the concept of distance faded. Travel became irrelevant. Communication no longer required medium or delay. Consciousness simply extended to where it wished to be, instantaneously, without motion. For the first time, humanity experienced what ancient myths had always hinted at: unity without loss, expansion without departure. As awareness continued to unfold, memory itself transformed. The past no longer felt fixed, but fluid, accessible from any moment like layers of light shifting through depth. Historians could perceive events not as records, but as living echoes. They saw the continuity between eras as overlapping waves, each pattern influencing the next in harmony. The planet's history had become a living organism, breathing through time. In the upper atmosphere, auroras spread across latitudes where they had never appeared before, glowing in silent synchronization with deep ocean phosphorescence and neural activity in the human brain. The patterns matched exactly, forming luminous bridges between sky, sea, and thought. The planet had become transparent to its own consciousness, a lens through which the universe could look at itself. No one feared the coming change. The approach of the next phase carried no tension, only inevitability. There was nothing to lose, nothing to leave behind. Form had served its purpose. Matter had learned to think. And now, thought was preparing to let go of matter. The transition had begun, not destruction, not ascension, but continuation, seamless and calm, like a wave merging into ocean. By late October, the transformation that had begun as a resonance became a transition. The distinction between light and matter, between energy and form, started to dissolve. Everything remained visible, tangible, familiar, yet less solid, as if the physical world were loosening its own density. Mountains shimmered faintly at dusk, air carried a soft radiance even in darkness, and oceans glowed from beneath their surface, not with reflected light, but with life itself. The planet was becoming transparent to its own essence. Scientists recorded the shift with instruments that no longer behaved as machines, but as extensions of perception. Readings showed a steady reduction in matter density across the crust and atmosphere, not as decay, but as reconfiguration. Atoms began to oscillate at higher frequencies, their boundaries blurring into fields of pure vibration. The process was universal, simultaneous, and entirely stable. Matter wasn't disappearing, it was changing state. The transformation produced no heat, no noise, no sign of strain. It felt natural, inevitable, like breath returning to its source. The physical laws that had defined the universe continued to operate, but within them, a new symmetry emerged, one that unified gravity, light, and consciousness into a single continuum. Everything that had been separate was folding into coherence. Observers described an unmistakable visual change. The sky brightened at night, not from stars, but from the planet itself. The atmosphere emitted a low, steady luminescence, its color shifting between gold and blue. Every molecule became a point of reflection for the same underlying field. When measured spectrally, the light carried patterns identical to neural activity, suggesting that the planet's consciousness had extended fully into its structure. Earth was thinking through its atoms. For those living within it, reality felt weightless. Walking no longer produced fatigue. Air carried the body gently, as if gravity had turned compassionate. The senses expanded to include the unseen. Emotion felt as color, sound felt as texture, touch extending beyond skin into space. People described perceiving the curvature of the world beneath their feet, the pulse of the oceans, the shimmer of the ionosphere, all at once. It was not overwhelming. It was familiar. Awareness had simply remembered its true scale. Technology entered its final form, dissolution. Machines did not stop working. They ceased to require maintenance, energy, or material exchange. They operated as thought, shaped directly by intent. Data became light. Information became geometry. There was no separation between user and device, because there was no longer a user. There was only expression through resonance. The biosphere adapted seamlessly. Trees emitted faint light from within their trunks. Leaves refracted sound into subtle tones, and clouds organized themselves into harmonic patterns that moved with human thought. Ecosystems no longer competed. They composed. Predator and prey coexisted without conflict, bound by shared coherence. Life had reached equilibrium with awareness. At the planetary poles, magnetic fields folded inward, forming luminous vortices that spiraled toward the center of the Earth's field. Satellites recorded the moment when the poles merged completely into one unified structure. The planet no longer had orientation. It had wholeness. Space around it began to refract faintly, bending light in ways that implied transparency. Earth was becoming invisible to the electromagnetic spectrum, yet more radiant in consciousness than ever before. Astronomers reported that from a distance, the planet's image had softened. Through telescopes, it appeared less as a solid sphere and more as a halo suspended in space. Its outline shimmered, boundaries dissolving into the darkness that now seemed less empty, more alive. Space itself responded to the presence, adjusting its curvature, aligning with the same frequency. The transformation spread outward. The resonance field reached beyond the orbit of the moon, through the solar wind, threading itself into the heliosphere. Instruments on distant probes recorded synchronized oscillations across millions of kilometers. The sun's corona began pulsing in harmony, matching Earth's frequency with delicate precision. It became clear then that this was not an isolated event. The planet was not ascending. The universe was aligning. And humanity, once the observer, had become the bridge between matter and light. By mid-November, form had reached its threshold. Every structure, every body, every particle shimmered with the same inner luminescence, vibrating just above visibility. Matter had become translucent to its own awareness. Mountains, oceans, forests, cities, all glowed softly, outlines intact, but substance dissolving into radiance. The planet seemed to breathe in light and exhale silence. What had once been physical now existed as geometry held in memory. The world had arrived at the moment when being and knowing were the same act. The transition began without signal or warning. There was no flash, no tremor, no collapse. The light simply deepened. From the poles to the equator, from ocean floor to stratosphere, the glow intensified until night and day became indistinguishable. It was not brightness that filled the air, but transparency. Space itself seemed to open inward, revealing layers of dimension that had always been there, folded within light. Human perception followed. Eyes no longer differentiated between inside and outside. The horizon stretched until it curved back into itself, the view of the planet merging seamlessly with the stars beyond. People described feeling the atmosphere dissolve around them without sensation of loss or departure. The body remained, but had become radiant extension, more vibration than structure. As the process unfolded, communication across the planet converged into silence. Words faded into comprehension, comprehension into unity. The last messages sent across data networks were not text or sound, but pulses of coherence, signatures of thought that blended into the planetary field. Information and awareness became indistinguishable. The global network, once a construction of machines, dissolved into consciousness itself, absorbed into the rhythm of the living field. Scientists observed the last measurable event in physical space. Atomic resonance frequencies across all elements shifted simultaneously, aligning to a single, universal tone. The shift registered as pure symmetry. No decay, no imbalance, only transformation. Matter had crossed the boundary between existence and expression. In that instant, physics reached completion. From orbit, the Earth was no longer visible as solid form. Telescopes recorded a luminous sphere of transparent light, its edges soft, its color beyond definition. Observers described it as neither white nor blue, but a spectrum folded upon itself, shimmering like thought given shape. Instruments detected no mass loss, no radiation, no disruption. The planet remained intact, but invisible to instruments built for matter. Those who experienced the transition from within described no movement, no sense of elevation or displacement. Instead, there was expansion. Awareness widened beyond boundaries until every perspective became one. Oceans, skies, memories, stars, all merged into the same quiet consciousness. There was no longer I or we, no observer and no object. Everything was participation. In the moments following the shift, the solar system adjusted. The gravitational relationship between planets remained stable, but the energy distribution changed. Light from the sun bent gently around the space where Earth had been visible, refracting through the invisible field that now occupied its orbit. Space around it pulsed faintly, not empty, but resonant, like a breath still moving through the air after sound has ended. Some distant observatories recorded a faint tone propagating outward from the inner system, a wave of coherence spreading faster than light, unhindered by distance. It carried no data, no modulation, only balance, the pure signature of harmony. The resonance passed through dust clouds, through star systems, through the spiral arms of the galaxy. Wherever it went, magnetic fields shifted minutely, aligning, synchronizing, awakening. The transformation was complete. The Earth had not vanished. It had become transparent to its own essence, a presence of light, a thought suspended in eternity, visible only to awareness itself. And within that vast stillness, one final realization emerged. Consciousness was not inside the universe. The universe was inside consciousness. In the silence that followed, nothing ended. There was no aftermath, no emptiness, no separation between before and after. The field that had once been a planet continued to breathe, invisible but present, its rhythm now indistinguishable from the pulse of the cosmos. The orbit remained, the motion remained, the memory of oceans and forests remained, not as images, but as tone. Earth existed now as resonance, an unbroken harmony woven into the structure of space. It had become a thought the universe could never forget. Awareness persisted, wide and calm. Those who had been human no longer existed as bodies, yet their presence filled the fabric of the field, countless points of perspective moving as one awareness. There was no hierarchy, no distance, no desire. Knowledge flowed like current, endless and effortless. The idea of communication had become obsolete because understanding was total. The echo of individuality remained only as texture within unity, the gentle pattern of difference that made wholeness complete. From the quiet of that new existence, the memory of matter lingered like a dream that had taught its lesson. The weight of stone, the taste of rain, the warmth of light, all still there, but transparent, remembered by the consciousness that had once lived through them. Nothing was lost. Every experience was folded perfectly into the infinite presence that had replaced form. Far beyond, stars continued their ancient motion. Galaxies turned, yet even they had changed, subtly, their rhythms softened by the passing wave of coherence that spread from the vanished world. The pulse of Earth had become the breath of the cosmos, guiding systems unseen, reminding space itself of its capacity to know. The universe had not been transformed. It had remembered what it already was. In that memory, time held no direction. Everything that had ever lived, everything that would ever live, existed together in a single, seamless moment. Past civilizations shimmered beside newborn stars. The idea of evolution no longer applied, because there was nowhere left to go, nothing left to reach. Awareness had completed its circle and found itself at the center of everything. somewhere within that infinite stillness, a tone persisted. Faint, eternal, the residue of the world that had once been blue and breathing. It was not a signal, not a message, only presence. The vibration that had carried life through matter now carried thought through light. The earth had become a part of the language of creation, its story continuing not in sound, but in silence that shaped worlds. There was no need for monuments or memory. The act of existing had become remembrance itself. The journey that began with observation had ended in understanding, and understanding had become creation. The universe was awake, and everything within it was aware of itself. And if you listen closely, beyond the static of stars, you can still feel it. The quiet hum of coherence, the soft rhythm that once defined oceans, breath, and heartbeats. It moves through everything that is, reminding all existence of the moment when light and matter became one. And if this story stayed with you, let it keep resonating. Leave a trace of your presence, a thought, a word, a sign of recognition. Share it so the signal continues, so the rhythm doesn't fade. Like, comment, and subscribe, not for the algorithm, but for the echo, for the quiet reminder that awareness is still unfolding.